Our more colorful and entertaining residents strut their stuff for this Oregon Field Guide special, Birds of Oregon. From the desert to the sea, you'll see rare glimpses of diving seabirds, dancing grebes, hungry owls on the hunt, acrobatic tufted puffins, majestic golden eagles, and a lot more. And you get to watch them in some of the most remote but beautiful settings in the world. It's estimated that more than 350 bird species can be found within our border. So the trick was to figure out which ones to focus on. We decided to concentrate on the birds that are willing to make more of a commitment to Oregon. And by that, I mean birds that stay here long enough to breed. Now the next step was to organize them in a way that can be easily understood. The traditional way of arranging them according to scientific classification can be confusing. So I turned to the National Audubon Society for help. It groups the birds according to obvious similarities in appearance, such as long-legged or duck-like, as well as similarities in habitat or behavior, as in upright perching water birds. And that leaves us with 14 groups. It's an amazing collection. We hope you enjoy the show. The hawk-like birds have sharp talons and hooked bills for tearing their prey. Oregon is home to 16 different birds in this category. They include the red-tailed hawk that can be seen flying high over open habitat all over Oregon. They have a wingspan of up to 52 inches and are very similar to the Swainson's hawk. The much smaller sharp-shinned hawk has a wing spread of only 13 inches, a good size to negotiate flying around its preferred habitat of forests and woodlands. The larger Cooper's hawk also prefers forests and woodlands. It, like the northern goshawk, has a wingspan of 33 inches and also prefers a diet of birds and small mammals. The ferruginous hawk is another big bird with a 54-inch wingspan that prefers open country. The northern harrier, seen here apparently thinking about lunch, used to be known as the marsh hawk because of its preference for living near marshes, grassland, and wet meadows. And then there's the turkey vulture, which with a 5-foot wingspan also prefers open rangeland. The American kestrel, one of our most common raptors, is quick to adapt and may have actually benefited from human activities. That's clearly not the case for the osprey.
To observe the birds diving, catching fish is an exciting thing.
Today, more people are getting a chance to watch osprey at work. It's a remarkable sight. They're the only hawk that dives into and under the water to catch fish. Their large nests are easy to spot, right in the open in the very tops of broken-off trees. It's easier to see osprey than it used to be because there are lots more of them, and they've adapted to our presence. This nest is right next to the I-84 freeway.
Ospreys probably habituate to man much more than most of the raptors do, much more than bald eagles, certainly.
Chuck Henney works for the National Biological Service. The young birds lie flat in the nest when the adults are away to remain inconspicuous to predators. These birds are about 6 weeks old and already getting quite strong.
Now those talons look like they're big enough to grab you pretty good.
Yeah, he did.
The adult birds circle overhead and complain loudly. But these juveniles are old enough that our brief visit causes no harm. When Chuck began studying osprey in the 60s, they were in big trouble. There were few nests, and most failed to produce any offspring. To maintain the population, about one young bird must survive from each nest. In the 60s, that wasn't happening, but in the 70s, something changed.
Ospreys now on the Willamette River are producing about twice that much. And of course, the population's increasing at about 20% a year. You know, these birds have probably been flying for less than a week. You can usually tell that by their flights are short distance. The landings are less than ideal most of the time.
And when they do land, the juveniles sometimes look a bit unsteady. But these youngsters have only 6 weeks to learn to fly and catch fish before the big fall migration.
And then they're off on a migration that's several thousand miles down into southern Mexico and into Central America.
The prairie falcon stays fairly close to home and prefers to nest on rock outcrops or cliff faces high above surrounding open country. And you can usually find quite a few of them where prey is common, a stark contrast to the endangered peregrine falcon. This 2-pound feathered bullet is nature's fastest moving animal, flying along effortlessly at 60 miles an hour. And when it dives for prey, it can hit speeds up to 150 miles an hour, earning the nickname Ruler of the Skies. But even the peregrine falcon's amazing speed wasn't enough to protect it from man.
As we were trying to get rid of our mosquitoes and other noxious insects in the early 40s, 50s, and through the 60s using DDT, we didn't know that we were contaminating our environment and contaminating the food for birds like this peregrine.
Bill Haight, a biologist with the Department of Fish and Wildlife, says the falcon's prey was birds, small mammals, and reptiles that had eaten insects contaminated by DDT.
They started laying eggs with soft eggshells, and they just failed to hatch, and over time we saw fewer and fewer of these peregrines, and they eventually almost disappeared from the state.
20 years ago, the peregrine was on the verge of extinction. Only about 30 pairs were surviving in the western states. One pair nested near Crater Lake. Since the use of DDT was outlawed in 1972, we are seeing more of the falcons. But Bill Heinrich, a research biologist, says that ban came too late, that most of the damage had already been done.
In order to save the peregrine, which by now had become extinct east of the Mississippi River, we needed to form some kind of a captive population and attempt to at least, number one, learn how to breed them in captivity, number two, learn how to release them back into the wild, and then answer question number three, would these birds be able to survive?
Over the last 30 years, a number of sites, like this one at Cascade Head, have been set up to release the falcons. It's been a long process, but even though the peregrine falcon remains on the endangered list, its numbers are growing and they're learning to adapt to mankind, even to the point of at least one mating pair setting up a nest in downtown Portland.
February becomes March, and then April. And as in previous years, the falcons do build their nest below the eastbound deck of the Fremont. They mate there on the beams, 180 feet above the Willamette River, and tantalizingly out of sight. The female is a much bigger bird, the better to keep eggs warm on the nest. But the smaller male, the fastest bird there is, faces a huge challenge with a brood on the way.
He is the primary food provider. He will provide food to the female to show that he is a good provider. He'll bring her plenty of food items so that she's able to keep her nutritional level up as she's forming eggs inside of her.
The male and the female take turns guarding the nest ledge, a platform at the intersection of two huge steel beams. The pair has hatched 3 healthy female chicks. The Fremont size affords the birds the same high-altitude security they seek in the wild.
Peregrines are nesting in urban areas because there are tall structures. There are cliff-like structures in a city, whether it be buildings or bridges. And also there's a preponderance of prey.
Another month passes. The chicks are much larger now. Adaptability is a key strategy in nature. And adaptability has made the huge centerpiece of the Portland Harbor industrial area, a peregrine falcon home.
Our search for golden eagles led us to Jim Anderson, an expert on Central Oregon's birds of prey.
That golden eagle's nest is right close in here, and it's an old timer. It's been here for quite a spell.
His first stop is a cliff nest in Deschutes County.
The male spends a lot of time babysitting. The female spends her time hunting, and that's quite common for the birds of prey.
What's not so common is how the father bird stays on the nest as we get surprisingly close.
Very unusual, very unusual. The first thing that happens when you walk up on a nest like that, you happen to be there at the wrong time, why, pa-boom, they're gone.
The 2 eaglets are too young and too small to band.
They're about probably 4 weeks, 3 to 4 weeks.
So Jim will have to come back in a couple weeks for that. But he does find the adult's perch tree nearby.
No, that's a jackrabbit's hind leg. Jackrabbits are the #1 item on the golden eagle's list of prey. A baby eagle growing up, when he gets to be about 4 weeks old, will eat almost a jackrabbit a day. If there wasn't enough to eat, those two babies in the nest would be quarreling continually. One would be pushed out of the nest by the other.
Jim thinks the young birds at another nest may be a little older. Well, a little older and much bigger.
That kid is huge. So far, I only see one baby, though. Maybe they only got one. That's why it's so big. For having all that down on it, I'm rather surprised at how strong it is. He's walking around having a good time.
But this single eaglet, tended by its male parent, is also too young to band. We decided it was best to leave this nest alone and come back later. And look at what a difference just 2 weeks makes in the eagle's development.
Golden eagles grow so rapidly you can almost hear them grow. They consume enormous amounts of food at this age.
Jim works quickly to examine and band the bird and get it back to the nest.
Take a look at those talons, how long they are, and they're needle sharp. There we are. See how big that is? And this bird's only about half grown.
The parents keep a close eye on us, but don't seem to mind that their baby's been handled, since eagles, like most birds, cannot smell. But it's time for us to go and search for the more elusive bald eagle.
A storm growls around the marsh. After all, it is January in the Klamath Valley. Everything that flies seeks shelter. And our search for eagles suddenly becomes complicated. There may be 450 bald eagles here in the Klamath Basin, canvassing 90,000 acres in search of food. But where exactly they might be just now is anybody's guess. Another complexity: the sudden cold, harsh weather has made them nervous. They show us their white tails at the first sign of approach. Timidity, an unpublicized part of the bald eagle personality. Our shy star is about ready to head home for the night. The roost is an old-growth timber stand on the slope of a canyon due west. Hundreds of birds may be found in the same cluster of trees, the one time of the year the bald eagle tolerates company. Most of the time, the bird is as independent as our forefathers supposed, a silent and distant creature. A scavenger, yes, but a discreet one.
A few years later, we had better luck spotting the bald eagles when we headed to the lower Columbia River with Mike Patterson.
This is an adult female in the top of this Douglas fir. Oh yeah, there's the other juvenile right here behind us.
Mike teaches science at Astoria High School. His educating people about local birds is an extracurricular activity.
They usually start getting their white head in their 4th summer or 5th summer. That's about a 4th-year bird, though. It's just starting to get some white in the head. I've been watching birds since I was 13 years old, and up until the late 70s, finding an eagle was a really big deal in most of the state.
In fact, eagle numbers had dwindled due to pesticides in the food chain, habitat loss, and out-and-out killing.
They were considered a threat to livestock. They were considered a threat to the fishing industry.
But thanks to changing attitudes, and of course the protections of the Endangered Species Act, the bald eagle is back. There's also a lot of work going on to bring our last hawk-like bird and the largest North American bird of prey back to Oregon.
When Lewis and Clark came down to Columbia, they saw quite a few of them.
For 100 years now, the largest bird in North America has been absent from once familiar territory.
It would be awe-inspiring to see a bird with a 10-foot wingspan flying overhead in the Columbia Gorge.
The so-called California condor, shown here soaring thermals over Ventura County, California, careened to the verge of extinction. But now the Oregon Zoo is part of an expanding program to breed, release, and reestablish the endangered condor across the region. Zoo Director Tony Vecchio says the huge bird's anticipated rebound may one day mean a return to its ancient Columbia Gorge territory.
Lewis and Clark called it the beautiful buzzard of the Columbia, which is a much nicer name, I think. And the Native Americans for thousands of years referred to it as the thunderbird. So it's only been recent times that it's been the California condor.
The first condors to live in Oregon in 100 years reside under tight security in a zoo facility in Clackamas County. The breeding compound was designed with experience gained in similar facilities in California and Idaho. It strives to isolate the birds from human contact and is shielded even from approaching caretakers. The Oregon Zoo breeding program will likely supply birds for release in the Grand Canyon, Central and Southern California, and Southern Oregon. Someday the Oregon coast and wilderness areas may offer vistas like these over the grasslands of Santa Barbara County, California. Heavily populated northwestern Oregon may not provide ideal habitat for condors, but someday, Oregon Zoo Director Tony Vecchio believes, condors might buck the odds. They may again consume fish on the banks of the Columbia.
This well-known group of birds varies in size, with large round heads and loose, fluffy plumage. Oregon has 12 different breeding owls. The western screech owl, standing 9 inches high, is Oregon's most common small owl, and like the smaller northern pygmy and flammulated owls, nests in abandoned woodpecker holes as well as holes in cliffs. The burrowing owl is just the opposite. It likes to nest in modified burrows made by ground squirrels or badgers. It has a wingspan of 24 inches. The short-eared owl also prefers its nest low. It's usually a depression in a marsh, meadow, or grassland with little or no lining. The long-eared owl likes to nest 15 to 30 feet above ground. The great horned owl, standing 2 feet tall, is only slightly smaller than the great gray owl and is a major predator of the spotted owl. But it's not the only one.
Spotted owls are territorial. When they hear our imitations, they think it's another owl invading their territory, and that's why they respond. Okay, here she comes right through here.
The spotted owl, it seems, is anything but shy. And as scientific surveys go, this one is pretty easy. It took just a few minutes of calling for Dr. Eric Forsman and Amy Price to bring Oregon's most notorious bird out of hiding.
That call right there is the common four-note hoot that you hear normally when you're out doing surveys. It's the most common call that we hear.
This spotted owl head count is done throughout the Oregon Coast Range. It's part of an ongoing, 2-decade-old research study. The study remains funded in part because of the lingering controversy over owls and logging. But while the owls have been protected by law since 1994, Eric sees little evidence of recovery.
One of the main techniques that we use to locate nests or to determine if spotted owls have produced young is we put a mouse out. That's part of their normal foods. Once they take the mouse like that, we normally try to follow them to see where they're going to go to with the mouse.
Eric had hoped the owl would lead him to a newborn. He was disappointed.
Yeah, all she's going to do is eat it. If she was still nesting, she would carry that mouse right to the nest to feed the young, and she's not doing it. So it's just a sure sign that she's not nesting.
Even in the best of circumstances, owls don't always successfully raise young. But every vacant nest is a setback for the species. The number of spotted owls in Oregon has declined steadily, about 1% a year. This despite increased protection of owl habitat. Eric says a new threat has emerged, one that has nothing to do with chainsaws.
What has changed is that the barred owl has gradually invaded this area, and the numbers are increasing pretty rapidly.
The barred owl is not the same as the more familiar and native barn owl. Rather, the barred owl hails from the East Coast. No one knows why they migrated to Oregon, but one thing is certain: they are taking over the best spotted owl habitat. This 2-week-old barred owl, seen here munching on a snake, has evicted a nesting pair of spotted owls. Those spotted owls haven't been seen since.
We don't have a clue in the long run how this is all going to work itself out.
On most decent spring days in the Grand Ronde Valley, you can find Jim Ward out checking barn owl families.
This brood consisted of 8 individuals to begin with, and the oldest ones have already left. There's just 3 in here now. These guys will be leaving any day now.
They look as if they're ready to leave right now. These young owls are another success story for a project Jim started back in 1983. From plans found in a book, Jim built a nest box and put it up in the barn.
And within a week, the owls moved in the box and started nesting. Everything about these birds is designed to catch rodents. They've got rather large wings for their size. This allows the bird to move effortlessly over the terrain searching for rodents. Their feathers are really soft, allows for silent flight. Their face is designed much like a satellite dish. Their ears are offset. One ear is higher than the other, and the sound hits the dish and funnels to the ears. And research has showed that barn owls have the most acute hearing of any other animal tested.
Their hearing is so good, barn owls can locate and catch prey that is completely hidden from sight. Barn owls are the most widespread of the owl species, and unlike the spotted owl, they adapt fairly well to the presence of man. What they seem to lack are good places to nest.
Barn owls historically nested in cavities in trees, in caves, in cliffs, also in holes in riverbanks. And there just aren't very many of those sites available in the Grand Ronde Valley. From the time they fledge, their average lifespan is probably less than 2 years.
For Jim, the reward is watching the rapid recovery of barn owls in the Grand Ronde Valley.
And that's why I've enjoyed this project. I can merely tack a few pieces of scrap lumber together and really make a difference in these birds' lives. With 60 boxes up, most of them being used, there's a lot of birds out there now that probably wouldn't be around without the boxes.
This group is made up of 27 birds in Oregon that are usually seen swimming. It includes ducks, coots, geese, swans, and pelicans.
Come fall, the white pelicans won't stick around the Oregon-California border country. They'll use those big wings to do what they do best.
Pelicans are famous for catching the thermals, and you'll see flocks will lift up off the lake and will spiral upward on the thermals. And they'll go literally thousands of feet high and then glide out in migration, migrating from here down into the Central Valley of California and then on down into western Mexico, clear to as far as Central America.
Right now, though, in July, the pelicans are far too busy for whatever impulse will leave them wintering in the southern hemisphere. Even now, at the pelican colony, hundreds of rapidly growing but still helpless chicks are clamoring for food. And here in the Klamath Basin, perhaps 1,500 mated pairs of white pelicans are struggling to keep their young alive. Adult pelicans need 4 or 5 pounds of fish a day to survive. The parents have the additional burden of feeding their offspring. Each chick will eat 140 pounds of fish during its 10 weeks of dependency on the adult. But the white pelican is a social creature. The colony bands together. to make each marathon fishing expedition a communal exercise.
And generally, you'll see them whenever possible. They'll be pushing those fish into shallow water, into the bank, into the shoreline, where they can trap them, and then they're easier to catch.
The pelicans fish Klamath Basin's shallow lakes and marshes, filled with chubs and flathead minnows. And yet the area's largest pelican colony is 15 miles away from the food source, on arid Clear Lake. Here, the fish hide in deep water well out of reach of the pelicans. But the lake is closed to the public, and for the white pelican wary of human contact, isolation is vital. And so, the pelicans nesting on a rugged volcanic outcrop are raising some 800 chicks this year. Soon, the adult pelicans will return, their pouches full of fish. In some unknown way, adults seem capable of identifying their chick in the mob, and each fish will likely reach its intended recipient. The young develop as expected before joining the migration south in September and October.
Fisher Island in the lower Columbia River. Man's impact is barely noticed here. The grasses grow tall and wildlife can still be wild. Birds, deer, raccoons live with little threat from predators. Amid that rich wildlife population is the western Canadian goose. Hundreds of them nest on the island. The geese are year-round residents, and they do flourish here. The population is now 20 times what it was in the late 1970s. The eruption of Mount St. Helens is responsible for the favorable geese habitat. Ash falling on Fisher Island raised the elevation, creating a stable environment for the geese, unaffected by tides. But while the Canadian goose population is flourishing, it's taken a lot of hard work to have the trumpeter swans once again flying high over Oregon. Summer Lake is about to receive some very distinguished guests from afar. They too will be magnificent white birds, but even larger than the geese, and with a distinctive cry all their own. Trumpeter swans, like these in eastern Idaho, also used to winter in southern Oregon.
Gradually, as the continent got settled, trumpeters were wiped out just hand in hand with the white man's settlement. They're big, they're low flying, they're very easy to kill. By 1900, people thought they were extinct.
They were almost extinct. A couple thousand Alaskan birds survived, and about 200 Canadian trumpeters continued to migrate into the greater Yellowstone area of Idaho, Wyoming, and Montana.
We want to make the best possible use of these birds and sort of get them seeded into good habitats. South Central Oregon is vastly superior in quality.
But the hardest part of getting the birds to Oregon is collecting them in the first place. Trumpeter swans may be, as Ruth says, easy to kill, but bringing them back alive and well is uniquely complicated. The swans spook easily, so these trumpeter quests take place only on dark, moonless nights, ideally with a cover of fog or falling snow. Tonight's run has been fairly successful. The half-dozen swans, neatly tied inside of grain sacks, are put ashore. Other trumpeters are being relocated to other western states, but the letter X on the bands indicates that these are Oregon birds. They also receive metal leg bands.
All the birds going to Oregon are marked on the left wing. It will help us follow the movements. People will report these yellow swans. By summer, they'll molt out these old feathers, and the dye will be gone.
While large numbers of trumpeter swans used to winter at Summer Lake, experts aren't sure if it ever supported a permanent year-round flock of the birds. One of the goals of this project is to establish a small, year-round population of trumpeters here. 13 hours and a couple of trucks later, the Idaho birds arrive. There's a little snow in the air, but compared to the environment they left behind, this is like springtime.
There's a lot of good habitat within 50 to 100 miles of Summer Lake. If all goes well, and it's going to be up to the swans, it could, under the best conditions, probably winter 300, 400, 500 trumpeters. Maybe some 100 or 150 might stay year-round.
Okay. Good. Good. Yeah, that looked excellent. Did just what they're supposed to do. Yeah, that's right, just land right there.
The hope is real strong that within a decade, trumpeters will be back in Oregon, very strongly.
There's no shortage of ducks in Oregon. They're not only the most plentiful birds in this group, but like this hooded merganser, are also some of the most beautiful. This is also the only merganser that's restricted to North America, unlike the larger but less colorful common merganser that can also be found in northern Eurasia. The cinnamon teal is the only duck that breeds in North and South America, and with a length of 16 inches, it's only slightly larger than the green-winged teal, which likes to breed in freshwater marshes where there's lots of vegetation. By contrast, the blue-winged teal prefers the alkaline marshes of southeastern Oregon. This is also the habitat of choice for the northern pintail, one of our larger ducks. The northern shoveler likes to forage in large groups, working together to stir up the water as they look for food. The American widgeon will also feed off of algae, but prefers the leaves and stems of plants found in marshes and lakes. The redhead breeds around large freshwater marshes and lakes, feeding on plant material. But the harlequin duck likes its water a little rougher.
Harlequin ducks spend most of the year along the surf line of the coast, diving in the waves, searching for food. In spring, you might even see a male harlequin defending his mate from rival suitors. But these ducks leave the surf each spring and head inland to nest. Again, they choose seemingly inhospitable conditions, mountain streams with lots of whitewater.
I have a great love for anything that's wild, and harlequins are one of the wildest beasts out here.
Howard Bruner is doing research at Oregon State University, trying to learn more about harlequins, especially where they go to nest. But finding them on these wild streams is hard, wet work. After several hours of walking tributaries of the Molalla River and seeing no ducks, they're about ready to give up.
Where are they?
Then field guide photographer Todd Sonfleet spots a male harlequin way downstream.
I'm so glad you found these. Keep that guy, he's good.
Now, luck is on our side. The brightly colored male we're watching leads us to his much better camouflage mate.
Okay, now if you look right down at the base, run down the base of the tree, you'll see some brown that doesn't quite match with the rest. The bird actually has its head tucked. There it is, it just turned its head around. You just realized we're here. No, I see it.
The nest is 50 feet above the stream. Amazingly, the young birds will leave the nest almost as soon as they're hatched and follow mom right over the edge to reach the relative safety of the water.
And in fact, this is a pretty easy shot for them. Generally, it's a little rougher. We've had them on top of cliffs and stuff, and they'll just bounce down.
We leave this expectant mother in peace and head for the next creek over, where another female has already hatched her brood. Ravens, otters, raccoons, and many other animals will take baby ducks. So far, she's been lucky. All 4 ducklings are still with her.
The female will proceed to feed those young up until they're ready to fledge and fly with her to the coast.
Only a few days old, these harlequin babies are already swimming the rapids, exhibiting that adventurous spirit that makes them Howard's favorite.
Harlequin ducks are probably the most rough and tumble organism I've ever run across. That they are survivors in conditions that most organisms would be busted up and spit out. And these ducks live in them daily, from the surf to the Cascade streams.
The much larger mallard prefers slower moving rivers and streams and is one of our most common ducks. But there's nothing common about the wood duck. For wood duck watching, a city park like Portland's Crystal Springs is hard to beat. Wood ducks are forest ducks, but trying to spot them out there is not easy. And that's especially true for the female of the species, who, unlike the male, is colored for concealment. Now this is wood duck habitat, the sloughs around the Camp Rylea Army Base on the northern Oregon coast. Wood ducks nest and forage in forested areas near water, and they like to lay their eggs in hollowed cavities of old trees.
You got some eggs?
The problem is that over the years, lots of the best duck trees have been logged or cleared for development. In some cases, the wetlands themselves have disappeared.
How many eggs?
2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
But several decades ago, to counter the decline in habitat, people began to hang nest boxes near rivers and ponds. The birds seem to like the manufactured homes just fine. And today, some 10 to 20% of the country's wild wood ducks hatch in boxes like these. A wood duck hen lays an egg a day, but does not sit on them until she has a dozen or more. And when she does sit, the eggs begin to incubate together and hatch at the same time. This box was empty 2 weeks ago.
Are they all wood duck eggs?
Yeah, 23 eggs.
23.
Next week, Dave comes out on his own. There's one nest he thinks is ready to hatch out.
This is the youngster breaking out. Call that pipping. There's 15 eggs in this box, and most of them are in this stage.
A day later, the youngsters are out, trying to stay warm and get their bearings.
The chicks dry off and re-energize, rest up, because then comes the next show. When mom says it's right, you climb up to the hole and jump out and hope for the best. You might have 15 or 18 little guys up and out of the hole in less than 5 minutes. Boom, boom, boom. They're just gonna drop out and try to sort of cluster, and she'll pick them up and they'll go off and learn how to be ducks.
The newborn ducks have survived the raccoons that plague the nest boxes. Once in the water, bullfrogs become duckling enemy number one.
Everybody that can is gonna take them. All the predators, and God, they're easy pickings, and they're probably tender little guys.
Survival in the wood duck's world is just plain tough. The ruddy duck, like the wood duck, prefers a diet primarily of plant material, but will also eat mollusks and crustaceans. The lesser scaup seems to prefer animal food, like snails and clams, and since it dives deeper than most ducks, it doesn't have any trouble finding it. The rare bufflehead also feeds on crustaceans and mollusks it finds near mountain lakes. The American coot is perhaps the most common nesting duck-like bird in Oregon, with a length of 14 to 15 inches. The pied-billed grebe is one of 6 grebes calling Oregon home. The others include the horned, red-necked, and eared grebe, which at a length of just 13 inches is towered over by the much larger western and Clark's grebes.
At Upper Klamath Lake, spring is in the air. For grebes, it's time to think about romance and going dancing.
It's part of their courtship, part of their breeding behavior.
Ralph Opp is retired from his job as Oregon Fish and Wildlife biologist, but he still spends lots of time observing animal behavior.
I like wildlife in general, but the grebes are so unique. They just do some things a little different, and I think myself, like a lot of people, it just makes them more interesting. And probably the most prominent area in the United States for grebes is here in the Klamath Basin.
6 of the 7 species of North American grebes frequent the Klamath Basin. The largest and easiest to spot are the western and the Clarks.
Yeah, these look like the Clark's grebes. And
the two look a lot alike, and until recently were considered a single species. On the western grebe, black plumage covers the eye, while white surrounds the eye on the Clarks. Grebes are primarily fish eaters, and that's what attracts them to this area. Grebes are built for diving, with legs located way back on their bodies. They seldom fly except during migration. Male and female grebes look identical. You can spot males during breeding season because they're the ones offering fish to a prospective mate.
that apparently is part of the courtship display. Maybe it's a little bit like bar hopping for humans, buying drinks for your mate-to-be or something.
By providing fish, a male grebe shows he will be a good provider for his mate and their babies. But why do grebes expend huge amounts of energy water walking? Biologists think it demonstrates a high fitness level, and the synchronized behavior forms a strong pair bond. When a male does pair up with a female, he'll aggressively chase off any rival suitors, sometimes resorting to a sneak attack. But just as in humans, not every grebe relationship works out. This pair seems to be dancing blissfully, but watch as a third grebe enters the scene and appears to steal the girl. Once the pair has consummated its bond, the grebes move off the open water to raise their family. Both parents participate in raising the young, and babies often jump off one parent, swim a while, and then climb on the other. But the male still seems to do the bulk of the fishing, repeatedly diving for small fish to feed the hungry babies on mom's back. The babies will be full grown and fledged by fall.
Long-legged waders are medium to large-sized water birds with legs long enough to wade in fresh or salt water. The great blue heron is probably the bird most of us are familiar with. Standing 46 inches tall, it's hard to miss. At 25 inches, the black-crowned night heron is a little tougher to spot, plus it's mostly nocturnal. The green heron is the smallest heron at 17 inches and is making a comeback after almost disappearing around the turn of the century. Oregon is home to just one ibis. The white-faced ibis can only be found in a few marshes and wet meadows in central and eastern Oregon, feeding mostly on insects. The American bittern and the rarely seen least bittern feed on a variety of animals, including frogs, fish, snakes, and an occasional small mammal or bird. The snowy egret stands about 2 feet tall, and like the smaller cattle egret, is seldom seen in Oregon. The much larger great egret stands 39 inches tall and is also only found in a couple of places in south central and eastern Oregon. The sandhill crane, standing 44 inches high, is one of our biggest birds and has a wingspan of 7.5 feet.
Every winter, some 4,000 sandhill cranes arrive. They dodge the suburbs of Portland and Vancouver, yet they roost near the cities. Guests, uninvited, and by most people unnoticed. They are here in the marshy floodplain where the Willamette and Columbia rivers intersect. But sandhill cranes don't tolerate the curious.
They got their heads up. They're kind of nervous.
Even crane expert Gary Ivey can't get close.
We've got about 10 of them near the bait. We don't know really where these birds are coming from, but presumably some are coming from Alaska or someplace north of there. You know, cranes are one of the oldest orders of bird families. They probably evolved just after the dinosaurs disappeared. Sandhill cranes, there's fossils from 9 million years ago, but cranes in general are 100 million years old. They're an old ancient bird that have lived through long beyond human civilization, and they're adaptable, but they also have some rigid needs. They're very traditional and they live a long time, and so they're a lot like humans in some way. They change, they don't adapt to change real quick, but they can adapt.
Annual sandhill visits to the Willamette and Columbia confluence may have begun way before the Earth played host to humans. Gary Ivey's research may finally identify the birds that visit here as Alaskan, or Canadian, or even Russian sandhills. The satellite radios may help determine the role these birds play in the worldwide sandhill crane population. That could help assure the bird respect and the kind of welcome here it has come to expect.
Upright perching water birds are usually seen on rocks or trees at the edge of the water. Oregon is home to the third largest colony of Brandt's cormorants in the world. You can see this colony at Ecola State Park. Their breeding season starts in June or July, and the normal clutch is 4 eggs. This is a big bird with a length of around 33 inches, which makes it only slightly taller than the double-crested cormorant, which can also be found along the coastline, as well as in small colonies in marshes of southeastern Oregon. The pelagic cormorant will rarely head inland, and topping out at 26 inches is the smallest of the 3, which is maybe why these chicks are trying so hard to get fed. This tufted puffin is also hoping to get a little attention, but this time from its mate. And if successful, they like to dig out their nest in fairly shallow burrows on the slopes, and will occasionally nest in the same areas as the rhinoceros auklet, which, like the rarer Cassin's auklet, also digs its own burrow. The male and female rhinoceros auklets take turns incubating a single egg. The common murre also shares in the incubation process, but they don't actually set up a nest. They take turns holding the single egg between their feet, and they do it for up to 35 days. There's really nothing common about this bird. It can also dive up to 200 feet in pursuit of its prey, and because it spends most of its time at sea, it, like our next bird, is tough to find.
Out beyond the breakers, the seabirds ride the gentle swells to feed on fish and crustaceans. They find anchovies and sand lance and capelin within a half-mile of shore. But the open water habitat helps make some birds a mystery to interested humans. Feeding, sleeping, mating offshore as they do, the seabirds live their lives well beyond the limits of casual observation. Yet scientists have more than a casual interest in one robin-sized bird making its home on the surface of the Pacific. The behavior of the marbled murrelet may have significant impact on regional logging practices, and researchers are studying the bird as carefully as can be. To study the marbled murrelet is to track an entire life cycle at the outer perimeter of the human environment. The bird leaves the ocean to nest and produce its young in Coast Range forest miles inland. And for Kim Nelson, looking for a tiny bird in the forest is like looking for a needle in a haystack.
Ornithologists have been trying to figure out what the murrelet's been doing since the late 1800s. They fly 60 miles an hour, and most of their activity is at dawn and dusk when light levels are very low.
But this morning will not be good for bird watching. Kim gets a flickering glimpse of just one murrelet. The team's primary contact with the bird this morning will be audio only.
You just hear them give their typical keer call. It's keer, keer, keer. Sounds like a gull.
Such faint contact is frustrating, but it does confirm there are marbled murrelets nesting in this part of the forest. Indeed, as daunting as Kim's work is, it has already produced results. This remarkable video of an adult brooding a newly hatched chick is the product of the team's efforts. And Kim's research allows her to generalize with confidence about some aspects of the marbled murrelet's behavior.
We know that these birds nest in old-growth trees. All the nests have been found only in old-growth trees. We know that they're found only in mature and old-growth forests.
Eventually, Kim's investigation may help forest managers know just how much forest should be set aside to ensure the bird's survival. The fact is that as late as the mid-1970s, no one knew where marbled murrelets made their nests. Now, scientists have a critical glimpse into the private life of a bird that is still, in large part, a mystery.
Adults will come back between 1 and 4 times a day, each adult, so the chick will be fed between 2 and 8 fish a day. The older it gets, the more fish it's fed. Compared to other birds like songbirds, it's not very much parental care at all. A lot of the songbirds, there will always be an adult with the chick.
The marbled murrelet's approach to parenthood seems consistent with a bird used to the sea, not the land. It does not build a nest as a songbird would. The videos show the marbled murrelet's nest is never more than a simple cup shaped in the moss on a high limb. Branches large enough to support such a nest don't exist on trees much younger than 200 years or so.
What they need is a large limb that provides a large platform in order for them to make a little depression and lay their single egg, which is about the size of a chicken egg. And so if you don't have a large flat branch that has some sort of soft substrate on it so that the egg will not roll off, then it won't work.
The marbled murret's dependency on old growth may one day make the bird as controversial as the spotted owl.
These water birds, which also includes terns and petrels, spend most of their time in flight. Oregon is home to 5 different gulls, including the western, ring-billed, California, and Franklin. So it's not unusual to spot one of them, as they can be found in a number of sites around Oregon. That's not the case for our last 2 birds in this category.
The sun is setting, and these seagulls, no good at hunting at night, will soon have to pack it in. Out there, far beyond the horizon, a little seabird dares not risk return to shore with gulls around. Should that little bird come home in daylight, a gull could swallow it whole.
Gulls are one of the primary predators on this rock.
But approaching darkness means the principal resident of Saddle Rock Island will be able to brave return to the coastline soon.
What you're hearing are these amazing vocalizations from these Leach's storm petrels. No other bird sounds like this, and on a typical night out here, you might be hearing tens or even hundreds of these voices at once.
Each shadowy petrel, having foraged for food sometimes 200 miles offshore, has filled its gut with tiny sea creatures. Now, in the dark, in relative safety, each petrel can feed its nesting chick. Perhaps 50,000 Leach's storm petrels nest on barely accessible Saddle Rock Island at Crook Point on the southern Oregon coast.
Petrels are very tough to study because they're a burrow nester, they nest underground, and they're nocturnal.
Dave Pitkin is a biologist with U.S. Fish and Wildlife. The secretive storm petrel, with behavior and life strategies poorly understood, is just one of many seabirds requiring researcher attention. The researchers avoid contact with the storm petrel burrows. Boardwalks prevent their feet from ever touching the fragile, sandy soil under which the burrows and the chicks lie. And net capture does not seem to bother the petrel. A bird captured in the net and then examined and freed will not forsake its nest.
There are other birds that will not stand for being handled, but these birds are very good about it.
Hitting the net, the adult storm petrel quickly regurgitates some of its stomach contents.
You can see that they've been eating euphausids or krill.
That diet sample is key to researchers' understanding of conditions the bird is facing far offshore.
They take turns going out. Both parents might come back and feed the chick in the same night, or the chick might get fed one night and then wait 2 or 3 nights and then get fed again. The energy that they put into raising their single offspring is totally amazing. Just to be flying so many kilometers to get food and to bring it back, and to be able to coordinate with the other partner to make sure that their chick is going to get fed when they hardly ever probably see their partner after the chick hatches.
So far, the study at Saddle Rock shows the birds there to be well fed. But conditions can change quickly. Still, the Leach's storm petrel strikes researchers as a bird that, given half a chance, can hold its own.
This is a very unusual colony. It's not like any other colony around the world.
It's the world's largest nesting colony of the world's largest terns, Caspian terns, some 20,000 of them. But for millions of juvenile salmon migrating down the Columbia River, these birds are bad news. Rice Island lies in the middle of the Columbia estuary, where fresh water meets salt water, just upriver from the Astoria Bridge. The island didn't exist until the 1960s, and even after that, it was little more than a long pile of dredge tailings until about 12 years ago, when the Terns began to set up house. Fisheries scientist Ken Collis works for the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission, or CRITFIC. He says that until 1987, few Caspian terns had ever nested in the estuary, but good nesting habitat elsewhere has been declining.
The terns tend to prefer a colony that's devoid of any vegetation, and these dredge spoil islands really fit the bill.
There's no terrestrial predators and not any human disturbance really, and this island, which is an artificial island, has provided the perfect habitat. That one might be looking for its partner. I don't know what it's doing. It's just...
Stephanie Adamani, a CRITFIC biologist, says the terns now come every spring in droves.
Look right out here.
For these birds, fish are the currency of the mating rituals.
Looks like it's trying to pass off to that one next to it, but that one doesn't seem very interested. Oh, it just ate it. So they'll do this a lot. They'll just jump on top of one another's back, and oh, that one's actually going for the copulation. It didn't even have to give up the fish.
A few weeks later, the terns have laid and incubated their eggs, and most of the chicks have hatched out.
There's a lot of fish coming in right now.
And now, the birds' fishing reaches a new intensity.
They'll only feed theirs. And the chicks, actually, you can see them being real aggressive, too.
The terns are catching and eating huge quantities of fish. OSU grad student Don Lyons studies the birds' feeding habits.
They're plunge divers, and they only enter the water 2 or 3 feet. And any fish that's deeper than that is really out of their range.
The sandpiper-like birds are a large group of small to medium-sized birds that have long legs and slender bills and are usually seen foraging on the beach or along lakes, ponds, marshes, or streams. But the willet prefers to breed along the margins of inland alkaline marshes, lakes, and meadows. The black-necked stilt shares the willet's preference for alkaline marshes, but will occasionally nest near shallow freshwater or saltwater marshes. The killdeer isn't nearly so picky. It'll breed almost anywhere in Oregon where there's an open area near water. The American avocet also likes to nest in open areas alongside freshwater or alkaline lakes and marshes, and they prefer shallow water for feeding. That's not the case for the black oyster catcher. It prefers intertidal environments and nests on offshore islands or rocky shorelines and cliffs. The greater yellowlegs is even more selective. While it's seen in various spots around Oregon, it only wants to breed at Downey Lake in the Wallowa Mountains. The Wilson's phalarope prefers to stay east of the Cascade Mountains, where it hunts on muddy shores and shallow waters. And yes, there really is snipe hunting. In fact, the common snipe is the only shore bird that can be legally hunted in Oregon. The long-billed curlew at 23 inches is one of the tallest sandpiper-like birds in Oregon, and its numbers have been dropping due to loss of habitat from agriculture. But the most at-risk bird in this category is the snowy plover.
A female snowy plover sits on her nest. It is not really a nest at all, for the wind has buried the scratchings she made in the sand. Now, the nest is nothing more than a couple of eggs above the driftwood line on a stretch of beach. She and her mate will spend 4 weeks sitting here, with no protection from the weather, waiting for the eggs to hatch. The long incubation is necessary. The baby snowy plover must be very well developed, ready to run at top speed as soon as it leaves the shell. For snowy plovers, survival is a battle against an environment that has turned increasingly against them. European beach grass, introduced by man in the 1930s, eliminated the miles of open dunes, the snowy plover's historic breeding area. Instead of laying eggs in the dunes the way it did for centuries, the snowy plover now makes do with unprotected beach. Skunks that live in the encroaching beach grass prey on plover eggs. Crows and gulls, drawn by scraps tourists leave on the beach, discover snowy plover eggs and devour them. With the increased pressure from predators and loss of habitat, snowy plovers' numbers on the Oregon coast have dropped. Snowy plovers are a threatened species in Oregon. No one knows how many snowy plovers lived on Oregon beaches before the beach grass and development changed things. But if the coast could be made hospitable enough to support 200 of the little birds, that would be a good start. Experts say everybody could rest easier about the snowy plover's long-term survival.
The vast majority of the upland ground birds in Oregon are game birds and difficult to find because of their ability to blend in with their surroundings. And clearly the biggest bird in this category would have to be the wild turkey. They were introduced to the West Coast in the late 1800s and are doing well in Oregon. They prefer open forests with grassy areas and hilly terrain near water. The ring-necked pheasant at 33 inches is another big bird. It was also introduced to Oregon in the late 1800s. The much smaller chucker came to Oregon in 1951 and is also doing well. It likes rocky canyons, hillsides with little vegetation, and sagebrush flats, grasslands, and open juniper canyons. The California quail can also be found in the sagebrush country of eastern Oregon and around fields throughout the rest of the state. The California quail, like the slightly larger mountain quail, doesn't like dense conifer forests. The ruffed grouse, much like the spruce and blue grouse, prefers more forested areas, but that's clearly not the case for our last two birds in this category.
The Steen's summit remains locked in winter, but spring is already bringing the surrounding lowlands to life. At first light these early days of April, the male sage grouse struts through its courting ritual. Whether females are present or not, the adult males keep it up, crowding the strutting ground with their curious dance. They expand two air sacs in their chest and fan their tail feathers in a repetitive, grandiose display. The males have used these same breeding sites for decades, calling attention to themselves repeatedly in this way to attract a female. When female sage grouse appear, singly or in small numbers, they may trigger a frenzy of chest puffing and tail fanning. But the female visits only briefly before seeking the isolation of the surrounding desert to lay her eggs and raise a brood of chicks. Bird lovers love to come and watch this strange behavior. But these days, scientists, too, pay close attention to the sage grouse. In the past 2 years, 56 nesting hens were studied, here in what is called the Jackass Creek drainage. Those 56 hens produced only 2 chicks that survived to adulthood, an amazingly bad performance. The mating behavior of the sage grouse, carefully documented over many years, does not itself appear to be a problem. But from April to midsummer, the hen must hatch and raise a brood. The chicks must be fed and protected from crows and coyotes and badgers. In some ways, the female is well adapted for the job. For instance, the hen's camouflage is almost perfect. Even a sharp-eyed expert like Mike Gregg has trouble spotting the birds with or without the radio.
You only can see them from one direction. You just got to keep circling around and looking, and suddenly there'll just be a bird staring out at you from here to the bush.
The only thing that moves is her eyes, which blink, shifting warily as we approach. But the hen's ability to hide herself and her brood is only as good as the vegetation that surrounds her nest.
At one time, Wallowa County was home to vast numbers of this bird, the Columbian sharp-tailed grouse. The grouse nested in the grasses every spring and stayed through the snowy winters, foraging in the brush and trees.
They formerly were found in all of the counties east of the Cascades to show you how abundant they were at one point in time.
But over time, the sharp-tails disappeared completely from the state of Oregon. These days, the sharp-tails are returning to Wallowa County, though not exactly in droves.
We probably have maybe 100 birds or so. This is the only population of Columbian sharptails in Oregon.
Vic Coggins works for Oregon Fish and Wildlife.
You're probably looking at one of the rarest native birds in Oregon. For sure, the rarest upland bird.
These birds came from remnant populations in Idaho, with help from fish and wildlife agencies, Oregon State University, and private landowners.
I think we have an obligation to try to bring some of our native wildlife species back.
For now, the only sure place to see them is on this patch of the Stonebrinks farm.
Their activity starts, well, probably a half hour or so before daylight anyway. It stops a few hours after sunrise, and they go off and feed. On their lek, their little males are territorial, and they've got their piece of ground there staked out, and then the fights break out, and the display is to attract the hens. And it obviously worked this morning because we have seen at least 3 hens out there with the males.
To track them to their nest sites and monitor their progress, Vic and crew trap and radio collar some of the birds.
This is a male, and it's radioed already, but we're going to change the radio. It's from last year. Scoot it down there just a little bit, maybe. Yeah.
He's going to have to work it.
He'll have to preen himself.
He'll have to adjust his necktie.
Okay. All right.
This is a modest new start for these returning birds, but slowly and surely, the local population of Columbian sharp-tailed grouse is booming. The chicken-like marsh birds are small to medium size, and as we found out when we went looking for the yellow rail, they're very good at hiding.
Under a full moon, Klamath marsh birds might stay active late into the evening. But tonight, the sun's disappearance behind the high Cascades brings total darkness. Coyotes and other predators have the advantage. Nature Conservancy biologist Ken Popper will be up all night, tracking a bird that also keeps late hours even in the darkness. Ken and Doug Lay of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service are seeking a bird that knows how to hide. They themselves are easy to spot, working across the dark marsh, headlamps blazing. But the yellow rail, a tiny marsh bird, so rare humans seldom see it, is not easily intimidated.
You can actually hear a rail calling behind me now. Kind of there's more than one calling, so it sounds like more of a constant, just clicking noise.
The clicking sound is a warning. The male is guarding his territory and telling competitors to stay away.
Well, the message is don't come near me, otherwise I'm going to come out and try to kick you out.
Since the yellow rail is active at night and hides in the daytime, biologists study them only at a huge cost in time and sleep. Yellow rails are so few in number they were thought to have disappeared from Oregon and the western U.S. long ago. Their distinctive call was still heard occasionally, but people attributed the strange sound to other sources, a malfunctioning electrical circuit, for instance. After 30 years with no sightings, the small southern Oregon population was spotted in the early 80s. Ken Popper hopes researchers never lose track of them again.
In the western U.S., west of the Rockies, this area is really the only area that we know they breed.
He believes the bird's prospects for long-term survival in the state are good. And yet he says the bird must be watched closely. And that need justifies his summers on the night shift.
I think they're gorgeous. Of course, I'm a little biased.
These birds are small to medium-sized, small-headed, and when they're on the ground, usually have a very distinctive gait. With the exception of the mourning dove, which mates for life, and the band-tailed pigeon, which also tries to avoid heavily populated areas, this is not a particularly popular group of birds.
The rooftops of downtown Salem, largely unfrequented by the Oregon State Capitol's human residents, are prime pigeon habitat. Salem has trapped and killed hundreds of pigeons as their growing population overwhelmed the city's welcome. Officials think maybe 1,000 birds had recently occupied an area smaller than 2 square miles. But to some, the numbers are an urban enhancement, not an infestation.
In most cases, usually your males are the more aggressive, outgoing birds that will venture first. These are 5 males right here.
Morris Eames, owner of a Salem newsstand, is one among many who do not share in any local hostility toward pigeons.
You have your blue bar, which is the male on the right. You have your light blue check, and then you have your dark blue check. So you have various colors.
Eames readily identifies the birds by their plumage. Some wing and tail feather patterns have changed a little since pigeons were first domesticated, perhaps 10,000 years ago. The birds can find their way home from great distances. Their ability to navigate a return to their home roost made them important message carriers. It earned them the name homing pigeons, and it wins Eames' respect.
These birds are just your common downtown pigeon. But even these birds have a homing instinct. It's just something that's in the pigeon's brain, which scientists still haven't explained.
Pigeons are not native to North America. They were brought here by European immigrants, perhaps as early as the 1600s. Settlers here raised them for food and for bird racing, and then freed them or allowed them to escape. Pigeons mate for life. A pair can raise 10 young a year. The creatures, native to wild cliffs in Africa and Asia, have adapted well to modern city life.
These small birds spend most of their time in the air, gracefully chasing insects. The tree swallow, like the barn swallow, prefers to nest near water and open areas for foraging. We're all much more likely to see the violet-green swallow because it is so versatile in adapting to different habitats, so it's common in urban areas. The cliff swallow, seen here in a man-made mud spa, is found throughout Oregon and lives in colonies of 1,000 or more. But that's a small town compared to the Vox's swift. Gary Sloan of the Audubon Society is helping some birds into a foster home, the chimney of a southeast Portland house.
Well, the 2 birds look fine.
The birds in question are of the smallest variety of North American swift, the Vox's swift.
Their feet, they're just like little tiny claws. They're almost like Velcro. And their only job as young birds is to cling to the side of their nesting environment. These birds were using old hollowed out snags for their nest sites, which are very much like chimneys. And over the past 100, 150 years, they've adapted somewhat. They've adapted to using chimneys. Other than the time that they spend inside a hollowed tree or a chimney, they are entirely in the air. They cannot perch on sticks. So they're totally unlike any other songbird that is a perching bird. Their toes don't work that way. They don't have an opposing toe in the back that allows them to perch.
In the spring, Vox's swifts migrate to the Pacific Northwest to mate. It's fall now. Time for them to fly back to Central and South America. As they prepare to go, they gather into large flocks that roost in chimneys all over Oregon. A great place to observe this is here at Chapman Elementary School in Northwest Portland. Because here, not just a few, but up to 30,000 birds swoop down like a tornado at dusk, funneling into this giant chimney. It's the largest concentration of Vox's swifts in North America and a birdwatcher's paradise. Soon, the swifts mesmerize the crowd with their giant, swirling formation and their lightning dives into the chimney.
It's like they try to get in, and then some of them peel off and take another.
Yeah, they're kind of taking turns.
Though the Vox's swifts are thick tonight, their numbers have been dwindling since the 1980s. This is due to loss of natural habitat, so they've chosen a man-made substitute. It's a great opportunity to observe and learn just why they are called swifts.
These birds will fly at over 100 miles an hour, and this is flying not in a dive, which makes them one of the fastest flyers.
Hummingbirds are tiny to small perching birds with short tails and long, thin bills. Anna's hummingbird is one of 5 that slows down just long enough to breed in Oregon. Spring is in the air. Just listen. Every year, about February, as the earliest shrubs and trees begin to blossom, the rufous hummingbirds start to return to Oregon. The other common hummingbirds here, the Annas, are year-round residents, so for many people, the arrival of the rufous proclaims the coming of warmer weather. After wintering in Mexico and Central America, these birds fly to the Pacific Northwest to breed. It's a long trip for such tiny animals, which burn tremendous energy just to stay in the air. And that constant need for calories is why they supplement their insect diet with nectar from flowers and sugar water from feeders, like these in a Portland backyard. Rufous describes the ruddy brown color on the back of the male bird, and its throat is adorned with a ruff of feathers that reflect a bright iridescent red. The plainer females, like this one, have no throat plumage and are greener on their backs. When the first birds do appear up and down the state, Elizabeth Thomas wants to hear about it.
Of all the hummingbirds, the rufous hummingbirds are the most territorial. They come in up when you're like changing their feeders, and they'll buzz you and say, you know, you put my feeder down or leave it alone.
She's always enjoyed all sorts of birds, but especially the little hummers.
They just have a lot of character, and they're really beautiful.
The tree-clinging birds are usually seen climbing about on the trunks of trees in search of insects. The northern flicker, seen here feeding its young, is found in just about every type of habitat there is in Oregon, and consequently is one of the most often seen birds in the state. The red-breasted sapsucker is one of 3, including the red-napped and Williamson sapsuckers that prefers forests for nesting and feeding. Another subgroup in this category is the woodpecker. This is the hairy woodpecker, who, like the three-toed and black-backed woodpecker, digs its own nest cavity in a tree, which the Lewis woodpecker will take over if it finds one deserted. The downy woodpecker is unusual in that it's also found in arid deserts and grasslands if there are patches of trees nearby. The pileated woodpecker is the largest Oregon woodpecker with a length of 18 inches. Unfortunately, it, like our last woodpecker, is losing habitat.
The ecosystem here in Central Oregon's high Cascades has long since been altered by logging and fire suppression. And with those changes may have come fundamental shifts in the roles some animals play. The disruption seems to favor squirrels, chipmunks, and other small hunters, for instance, while valuable bird species like the white-headed woodpecker suffer. Dr. Richard Frenzel spends up to 5 months every year tracking the white-headed woodpecker. He watches as the bird tries to adapt to a landscape irreversibly disturbed by decades of intensive management. The degree of success the white-headed woodpecker achieves in this changing habitat may be a clue to overall forest health.
The birds haven't been able to replace themselves over the last 5 years.
White-headed woodpeckers thrive in stands of 300-year-old pine like those that once dominated the territory. The giant trees harbor plenty of insects in their gnarled bark. The open space between the trees let the ever-alert woodpecker spot flying predators like hawks. Most of the time, the nest is a cavity in a snag. In the absence of open park-like old growth, the bird often chooses ground cleared and left open by logging. The white-headed woodpecker digs out a hollow area in the softening core of the snag. It is here, if all goes well, the mated pair of birds will raise its young. A common cause of nest failure is predation. Tiny mammals abundant in logged areas easily spot an adult woodpecker at work on a nest, and they can hear the babies begging food. They eat the woodpecker young and establish their own nest in the cavity. The factors that spell success or failure for the white-headed woodpecker nest are not limited to the behavior of its predators. Drought, depth of winter snowpack, food supply, even competition from other birds may influence survival.
Perching birds include nearly all of the songbirds and a few others that resemble songbirds. In Oregon, this category has over 115 different breeding birds. The American robin is one of the most recognizable birds from this group and one of the most abundant in Oregon. That's not the case for the various flycatchers. This one is a willow flycatcher, one of 9 different flycatchers breeding within our borders. The yellow-rumped warbler also comes from a large subgroup. It's one of 10 different warblers scattered around Oregon. The western wood pewee can also be found just about anywhere in Oregon. All it needs is a stand of trees to breed. But our next bird is much more selective.
This remarkable bird goes by 2 names, water ouzel or American dipper. But whatever you call them, these daring divers are unique. They're the only truly aquatic songbird. Ducks have webbed feet to paddle along the surface or dive in search of food. But ouzels have somehow learned to use their wings to maneuver underwater.
I mean, whoever designed an ouzel really knew what they were doing.
To learn more about dippers, we enlisted the help of Robert Grimm. He spent many years observing ouzels. Dippers almost always live near fast-moving water, and they're quite territorial. A family stakes out a quarter to a half mile along the stream.
The more remote, the better for an ouzel. Fast water, remote, no people. That's
pretty spots.
Find the best spots, where the waterfalls are, you betcha.
Dippers are voracious eaters, spending hours searching out insects, fish eggs, or their favorite caddisfly larvae. They beat them on rocks to extract the insect from its casing. But no matter how much they're in the water, they always seem to emerge perfectly dry.
All birds have a little oil gland just above the base of the tail. Ouzels have a very big one. They cover every bit of their feathers with this oil.
Feeding in the shallows, dippers can withstand incredible currents. When diving, they seem almost encased in air.
They all of a sudden turn a silvery color the minute they enter the water. It's almost as if a zillion little bubbles dress all the feathers.
To reduce drag underwater, dippers have small wings. The diving behavior may be what makes dippers unique, but it's that nearly constant up and down motion that has bird researchers intrigued.
When it moves, it closes its eye and then opens its eye, and then the world doesn't move. It's like being in a railroad car, you know. If something moved, did I move? Did the world move?
As part of his research, Grimm set up a film camera to record dipper babies.
And that little bobbing behavior was already started in the nest. That was the thing that I was after when I was doing the early work.
Most ornithologists presume the white-feathered eyelid is a way of alerting other ouzels.
It's a signaling device. Like here I am down the stream, or a visual releaser, as the behaviorists call it.
Then a lucky find. we spot a bird entering a nest just behind a small waterfall.
Classic place for an ouzel nest.
Even with a powerful telephoto lens, the nest is hard to pick out until an adult arrives with food.
Oh, wow, that's spectacular. Isn't that lovely?
The baby's big, bright mouths are a great target when begging for food.
That disappears in infancy. After they're on their own, all that yellow, that whole thing gets absorbed.
Male and female dippers look identical, and both help care for the babies. Unlike many birds, ouzels leave no droppings that might betray the nest location. The research film shows an adult cleaning up a fecal sac and dumping it in the water.
Hey, that's why I like ouzels. Look at that. Flying along and dives right in the brine. Out of the brine. Terrific.
The western scrub jay, like most jays, is not very popular among other animals. While we find them fun to watch, part of their diet is small mammals and bird eggs. The Steller's jay, with a length of 14 inches, is the largest of the 4 jays breeding in Oregon. The Clark's nutcracker is considered one of the oldest representatives of the subfamily of jays, which may have driven it out of most of its habitat. The marsh wren is the only one of 6 wrens in Oregon that will also eat an occasional bird egg. The European starling is arguably the most disliked bird in the state. An introduced species, it's considered a major pest, partly responsible for the decline of a number of birds, including bluebirds.
Look at that, he is so good.
Western bluebirds are related to the mountain bluebird found in eastern Oregon. The mountain bluebird is slightly larger, entirely blue, and now much more common than the western bluebird.
It's hard to believe, but in the early part of the century, the western bluebird was a very common yard bird in downtown Portland, as common as a robin. Anybody home?
Pat Johnston was one of the first volunteers on the Bluebird Project.
It's empty.
She says the Willamette Valley was once ideal bluebird habitat. They hunted insects in open meadows and built nests in woodpecker holes left in tree snags.
Very innocently, we logged the country off and took all the snags down.
Removing dead trees left bluebirds few places to live. Residential development and agriculture took most of the meadows, and pesticides killed the bird's insect prey.
We were the ones that caused it to fail, and we, I think, should be the ones to help it come back, since it's such a beautiful bird. 5 eggs.
To provide nest sites, the Bluebird Project has put up more than 1,000 birdhouses. At first, it didn't seem to help much, but recently, they've seen the number of successful nests quadruple.
He's about 8 days old. Feathers haven't started coming out of the sheath yet.
Females tend to choose mates who prove they are good providers.
He's going to feed her, watch. The males have nest fidelity, they come back. Now the female young usually disperse and rather widely, and that's because it's an instinctual way of avoiding too much interbreeding.
Now that the number of bluebirds is on the increase, the project is always looking for landowners willing to put up nest boxes. Ideal sites are above 500 feet elevation and have several acres of meadow or short grass.
Here, you guys look so healthy.
If you want to see these pretty birds, Shampooey Park near Newburgh is probably your best bet.
That's the baby begging. Now watch her. Okay, here she goes. She's taking it to take you right to the babies.
One of the things that I think of constantly is that our grandchildren and future generations will see this bird because we're making an effort now to try to save this species that is so special.
And they respond to what you do to help them. So it's really a wonderful thing. And to see them coming back is really a thrill.
The black-capped chickadee, like the mountain bluebird, will keep the family together long after the young fledge. The western meadowlark, our state bird, is also very family-oriented. It'll keep feeding the young for up to a month after they're born before sending them off on their own. The house finch keeps their young around for about 3 weeks. Some of the other Oregon finches continue to feed their young up to 7 weeks. The lesser goldfinch, like the American goldfinch, send their young packing around 2.5 weeks. The same holds true for the lazily bunting, but that's partly because they nest so close to the ground and prowling predators. The house sparrow is from one of the largest subgroups of birds in this category. There are 14 different sparrows in Oregon. The savanna sparrow, like most of the sparrows, likes to breed in areas near lots of water where there's plenty of insects to feed on. The bewick's wren also prefers small insects and spiders for its diet. The small bush tit shares the wren's appetite for insects and is growing in numbers around the state. The cedar waxwing enjoys a wide variety of fruits, berries, blossoms, and tree sap, particularly in the winter. The common yellowthroat will eat some fruits and seeds, but prefers insects, which are readily available around its habitat of marshes and wet meadows. The yellow-headed blackbird eats a variety of seeds and grains, and is considered by some an agricultural pest because of it. And this red-winged blackbird, defending its nest against a sandhill crane, shows it's not easily pushed around. And the black-headed grosbeak will also aggressively defend its territory. Quite often the male and female will team up to chase predators away. And that brings us to our last two birds. They're not particularly popular, but as you'll see, are really fascinating if you take the time to get to know them.
The American crow is relatively new to the western United States. It was an eastern U.S. species and midwestern species and followed man's travels across the United States. As the West was opened up, crows followed man.
John is one of the few experts on corvids, the family of birds that also includes ravens, jays, and magpies. Corvids are among the smartest birds in the world.
When we look at a crow or raven, you see a relatively large head for its body size. Crows have invested a lot of their adaptation in their brain, so they can solve problems that their environment poses to them.
Crows often gather in large numbers, like here at Portland's Oaks Bottom.
Crows don't like to do anything by themselves.
Ravens prefer smaller groupings and more rural areas. But the sociable crows have adapted well to life on the streets.
They live in large social groups that ebb and flow throughout the day, perhaps just getting to know their competitors and their colleagues better by being together and understanding what problems they've solved that particular day. It's not a particularly bad bird. I think the crow is a misunderstood bird. It certainly scavenges, and so it's associated with dead things, and people think that's evil and unclean and unhealthy. It may be a bad bird in terms of being a nest predator. It robs eggs and chicks of a variety of species. Unbanded one, I think, is the female. She was begging from him. It's an adult. You can tell because of the plumage and mouth characteristics of it. It's all dark, black, glossy plumage. Some of the younger birds are still brown, and the mouth especially is a good indicator of age in that it's completely black. And in a young bird, it'll be red and pink.
The big bird that just flew in, at least twice the size of the crows, is a raven.
That's a bigger bird than the crow we caught yesterday. Much larger bill, more active than the crows that were really kind of calm when we caught them. These guys are looking, they think they have a chance to get away.
Crows and ravens are interesting animals. But the increase of crows in urban ecosystems can only mean that other species are decreasing. And even John Marsleff, one of the crow's biggest fans, says their presence is a warning sign.
I think having more crows in general is not necessarily a good thing, as much as I love crows and I enjoy having them around to watch. But it shows that the system is out of balance. Where you get more human presence, you get more crows. And typically a heavier presence of humans on the landscape lowers the biodiversity of the area. So I think crows are a signal. They're not the ones causing the immediate death of the other species. We are, in a direct sense. And they're just the messenger telling us that. The system is out of balance because they're doing very, very well.